Welcome to Unforbidden Truth. I'm Andrew. Today I'll be speaking with forensic psychologist Dr. Dana Anderson, CEO and founder of California Forensic Psychology, is a nationally recognized expert whose work spans complex forensic assessments, risk evaluations, crisis intervention, and critical incident debriefings in the aftermath of violent crimes such as homicides, suicides, and sexual assaults. Her expertise is sought in high profile cases across cities like Las Vegas and Los Angeles, and she holds contracts with numerous government entities, including superior courts in California and Nevada, county health and human services agencies, and public defenders' offices. Licensed in both California and Nevada with a PSY PACT license, enabling practice in over 42 states, Dr. Anderson also educates the public as the host of the Killer Psychologist podcast, where she breaks down complex psychological and legal concepts. Beyond her clinical and consultant work, she is dedicated to mentoring emerging professionals in forensic psychology, ensuring the growth and integrity of the field, while solidifying her legacy as a transformative figure in forensic mental health. Here's my interview with Dr. Dana Anderson.
Hi, Andrew. So I'm Dana Anderson. I am a forensic psychologist and I'm host of Killer Psychologist podcast. So uh, I provide educational content about the role of a forensic psychologist in criminal cases. And so I'm a newer podcaster, just been doing it about a year. But I'm not new to forensic psychology. So um, I feel like podcasting or being on social media gives me an outlet to sort of share the dark side of the work that I do.
So tell me, in a nutshell, what all a forensic psychologist does on a day-to-day basis.
So, it's interesting because I think there's just such a misconception about what a forensic psychologist is. And so we get our information from TV shows, which I did. I watched Silence of the Lambs and Clarice Starling and was like, cool, I want to do that. But was she really a forensic psychologist? Um, so forensic means in the court system, and it doesn't necessarily mean the criminal justice system, but most of the time that's what we think. So a psychologist is in the legal system, and the court's typically asking the psychologist a psychological question, like, does this person have a mental illness? Right? And if so, what next? Are they competent to stand trial? Were they insane at the time of the offense? You know, are they a pedophile? What, if so, what do we do? What is treatment? Are they treatable? And, what should their sentence be? So it's really, in a nutshell, answering psycho-legal questions for the court. So I'm court ordered by the judge in cases to answer the legal question. So from day to day, I see defendants in custody who have committed serious crimes, and I evaluate them psychologically. And I answer the legal question. And one of the most common types of evals are before any criminal case can begin, it's part of your due process, part of your civil rights you can't be convicted of a crime you don't understand. So I have to evaluate them to see if they are competent to proceed to court. And so I do a lot of those. So from month to month, I probably do about 15 of those types of evaluations. And I don't get too many insanity cases. Those are much more rare. I do get ordered to evaluate sexual offenders, and I can evaluate them for different reasons. So really, my my role is really nuanced. So I can be ordered by the judge, and the court is my client, but a defense attorney could hire me too and want to get information about their client, right? And it might not be good, right? So I evaluate them and tell them information about their client that is not helpful to their case, right? So I spend a lot of time working with attorneys also and helping with legal strategies. And then in civil court, I evaluate um, typically like childhood sexual abuse cases. I'm evaluating the plaintiff um, to determine the validity of their claim and their damages and their diagnosis. And those are lengthy and complex. And then in family law court, child custody evaluations, at the end of the day, a forensic psychologist is just doing psychological evaluations on individuals that are involved in the court. So there's some sort of legal problem. At some point, the judge is like, what is going on here? We need a psychologist to answer these questions. And so usually I answer the question and I also make some helpful recommendations for that person and their treatment. So I play a pivotal role on whether someone might go to prison or the state hospital, right? Whether they should be a registered sex offender or they're safe or they were malingering, lying, right, for secondary gain, if they're high in psychopathy, whether they have schizophrenia, all of those factors. And so I find it incredibly interesting. I feel like I have a lot of, and it's just there's never, I've never had a dull day. I'm just always, um, I just find it very interesting. I find people interesting and I love like the conversations we have. I think it's fascinating to learn about mental illness and how it affects people. And it's sort of like a mystery, I feel like there's a mysterious question the court wants to know, and I get to sort of help figure it out. So it feels like putting a puzzle together, and it's like in the end, you feel satisfied. You're like, oh, yeah, that's what was going on, you know?
Right, a puzzle that sometimes doesn't normally get put together. I mean, depending on the person, huh?
Yeah, I mean, usually in the end, it sort of makes sense, right? Um, like I'll get a case and you can see it in the newspaper, like somebody that's killed multiple people, and it's like, oh my goodness, I would like to hear that story, right? And so I get a front row seat to interview them and be like, what happened? You know, and you get to find out all the details, which are pretty interesting.
Right, yeah, they really are. I've been talking to inmates for 15 years now, and like you say, there's never a dull moment with a lot of them actually. I mean, you have your typical one that's like there's like DNA evidence, eyewitnesses, you're on camera, and then it's like I'm innocent. And it's like, okay, well tell me why you're innocent when A, B, and C puts you at the scene of the crime. It's, interesting to say the least.
Yeah, I interviewed a guy in custody the other day, and it was a bank robbery. And he said it wasn't him, and he was on video camera and identified through multiple ways. And was he just had a very interesting different version of events. And sometimes that can be due to being under the influence and or being psychotic. So it's not uncommon for most of the individuals I see in jail were intoxicated or under the influence at the time of the arrest. That is very common. So it's, you know, and I see some pretty profound drug use. A lot of people, a lot of people lately withdrawing from fentanyl, pretty serious. Um, and I do encounter people that are suicidal and currently still homicidal while in custody. And so one thing that I can do is there are people that are just at a high risk for death in custody. And in the county where I work, they've had 71 deaths over the last 5 years, which is very concerning. So what I'm saying is um, substance use mixed with like psychosis and certain beliefs, like suicidality is pretty high. So one of the things I do as a forensic psychologist to prevent deaths in custody is I'm appointed by county council to evaluate high-risk inmates for to determine their level of acuity if they need immediately transferred out of jail to save their life. So I can evaluate them like within 24 hours and get a report to the judge and have them transferred out to a state hospital immediately, like within 30 days. And I've done it successfully and kept people from committing suicide while incarcerated. Like they're at the highest risk of death.
I'm sure that's got to be a good feeling, knowing that you're helping even just one person stopping from taking their life.
You know, I've I've had 100% success rate, and the last one I did, well, I guess it wasn't the last one, but one of them I did. The family reached out to me, the sisters, and they were so thankful. They sent me like messages, and they just said, you saved our brother's life. And they just were, they, it was powerful. Because they recognized it, because they were so afraid, because he wanted to die. And he had actually killed one of their family members. So um, these cases can be complicated, right? But a lot of times I see individuals who are suicidal and homicidal. Sometimes they've killed someone or tried to kill themselves, and they're very psychotic and they're under a different belief system, like that their life has to end and they're going to do anything they can do to make that happen. And when I see that and recognize that, we just have to get them into a safe place. And jails, while they can put someone on suicide watch, right? And it's not, if on the highest level of lethality, that is not the place where you want to be. You need to be in a psychiatric facility. So it is rewarding also, just so people understand. While I do deal with a lot of dark conversations, I actually feel like I'm a light in the darkness and I can help a lot of people. And I have interfaced with thousands of people, thousands and thousands of people over time that were suicidal or homicidal and prevented tragedies. So I think that's one thing that people don't really think about. Some people probably have a negative perception of a psychologist, right? Like, they're a shrink, they're just like talking to you, or like, what do they do anyway? And I hope I dispel that myth for some people. Like, it's not, some people have a very positive experience with a psychologist. And believe it or not, I actually do have happy customers from the jail, you know, uh, even though they're like, why are you here to see me? Right? I didn't order you. Why are you here? What do you want from me? But I think just how I approach it and just let them know my role, and um, just make it really clear what I'm there to do. And, I'm there to really assess their mental health and make recommendations for their treatment. So whether they like it or not.
Right, right. So what a lot of people ask me when it comes to prisoners is what's the common denominator with a lot of them, like similarities? What would you say are similarities that you notice among, or I guess they're not really offenders, pre-trial, but people that you see on a regular basis or even just once.
Yeah, one of the things would be that substance abuse is a common denominator across settings. So I've worked in the emergency room doing 5150s. I've worked in the psych hospital. I've worked in jail. I've worked in outpatient, worked with the state hospital. I work with parole. So substance use is a big issue. It's almost everyone. It is rare that I see anyone that doesn't have a substance use problem, whether they admit it or not. If right. So uh so drug use, alcohol use, marijuana, meth, I mean fentanyl, cocaine, hallucinogenics. I mean, we could go on. And then just benzodiazepines, people just abusing prescription medication. So that across the board, across time is a problem. And a lot of people try to treat their symptoms with drugs or alcohol. And as it turns out, it's not helpful at all. It makes their symptoms worse. So over time, if you're using and you're not taking care of yourself, right? So then it turns into other psychological problems. And people can decompensate over time. So another thing I see is there is lower IQ with a lot of these low-level crimes I'm seeing, and there's mental illness. So repeat offenders, right? So along with the substance use, there is a mental illness, and there can also be a cognitive impairment, like they're lower functioning, so they end up getting caught often, or they're living on the street, or they're homeless, right? Yeah, but I worked in the psych hospital for 4 years, and so everyone's drug tested or medically cleared. So it's almost rare to see anyone with a drug test that wasn't positive. And profound drug use. So like 5 different drugs in their system, right? Like, or at least 2 or 3. So I think I wish there was more education about substance use. I think people start using it early on in adolescence and don't totally understand what they're getting involved in. I interview people that start at very young ages, and it's introduced by adults or caregivers, which is tragic. So starting using drugs like at 9 years old, things like that, that's just quite horrifying. So what I'm saying is that's neglect and abuse if your parents aren't even caring for you or providing oversight. You're just left to, people introducing you to drugs and alcohol. So early onset use is a problem. And so it is sad.
Right. So I've read a few high-profile serial offender psychiatric valuations, which I find to be pretty fascinating. For those that are listening that aren't really familiar with what a psych eval is, can you break it down as to what it is and when and why it's ordered for somebody that's court ordered?
Yeah, so in a criminal case, a psychological evaluation, it can be ordered for a variety of reasons. The most common is the competency to stand trial. So that would be when I evaluate their mental health, write a report, and let the judge know, if there's any barriers psychologically to them being able to understand their charges or work with their attorney. And so that's one type of psychological evaluation. And then, of course, insanity as a defense, looking at their mental state at the time of the offense, while competency is their mental state currently, like right now, can they go to court? Insanity is at the time of the offense. And so there can be very specific reasons why the judge may order a psychological evaluation, but that's typically confidential and not something that you would have access to. It's usually sealed, and typically the defendant does not get a copy of that report either. So it's in their file, but you wouldn't have access to it.
Hmm. Um, so as a forensic psychologist, how much research is done on like a day-to-day basis? Like, are you just handed somebody's like medical record and mental health record, or do you have to actually like pry into them to actually like get all that and to know what you're dealing with?
So typically, as soon as I receive a referral from the court, I request the medical record file from the jail or facility, wherever they're at. And I have 30 days to do the report. So I review the medical record file before I interview the defendant. And I summarize it and pre-populate the report, and then I know what information I'm missing. So for example, I'll already know if they're medicated or if they're psychotic or if all have their records. So I do review a lot of medical records and criminal records. And some recently I got a case, there's like over 2,500 pages of just medical records. So showing you that that inmate had been institutionalized over the decades and had a very serious mental illness. So I don't need to typically research outside that, but I do review a lot of criminal records. And some jurisdictions or counties or agencies will send me like body cam footage, pictures, and other kind of information for me to review. So I can be watching the interview that they had with the police officer, right? So all of that I can, especially for insanity evaluations are much more complex because you have to get data points at the time of the actual offense. So in those cases, that is a deep dive to all the data at that specific time. So toxicology screen, right? Their incarceration, their medical records, whether they were 5150, interviews, surveillance, body cam footage, that can take, it could take 20 hours if I was like a high profile case where there was multiple murders, then I'm going to do a deep dive and spend a lot of time just reviewing everything. Sometimes the defendants are they're confessing to their crime, and that can go on for hours. And so I'll assess that as well.
So what would you say is the most common misconception about a forensic psychologist that you've heard?
So everyone, when I say forensic, I think, or even just forensic alone, not forensic psychologist, people, I think they imagine somebody at a crime scene. And so that's a misconception. So you, what am I doing at a crime scene, right? So one misconception is that people ask me, oh, do you work for the police? Or they assume that I work for the police department or the FBI, and that's not accurate. So there, that's just a huge misconception. So I wouldn't be going to a crime scene because who's going to pay me to do that? So if you hired me on your case and I got involved and in that way, hired by an attorney, I could be going to I could potentially be going to a crime scene, but the reality is that forensic psychologists do court ordered evaluations after someone has been charged with a crime.
Mm. Um, I don't know if this is would necessarily be like the work of a forensic psychologist, but let's say there's like a 5150 individual that's like that has like a few hostages or something like that. Like, would they ever call you to potentially like talk somebody down that's 5150? Because obviously law enforcement don't have really that type of training unless they're like a negotiator, type of thing.
So yes, I could help in those situations. And again, it would be like, but who do I work for and who's hiring me or who's paying me? So while I have done many 5150s and worked in the psych hospital, um, I'm inside the hospital. So, and sometimes we've had a hard time getting the person inside the facility and they've threatened suicide by cop, uh, or made, homicidal threats. And I've gone outside the facility, got in the van with them and like negotiated and talked them into safety. So, um, a lot of times now police have mental health professionals that can ride with them and they're trained and equipped to intervene and divert to a 5150 and get them to a psych hospital as opposed to taking them to jail. And I love to help with those types of suicidal, homicidal interventions. But the reality is who, like, how would I be retained? Who would be employing me? So I would have to have a contract with that agency, right? So typically it's not a psychologist. You'll see another type of licensed mental health clinician that works with a team, like their crisis um, team, depending on the jurisdiction or area, and that are equipped to do that.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, I've always been curious about that. Like if they contract with different like therapists or psychologists or whatever in those types of situations. So I know you spoke a little bit about it a few times, but can you talk a little bit about what not guilty by reason of insanity is and how often it's used, let alone how successful it is in a criminal trial? From what I hear, it's like tiny, right?
Yeah, well, once you say that it's, using that as a legal defense, you're saying I did it, but I was insane. So you got to be careful you use that because you're also saying, yeah, I did it, right? I killed this person, say, for example. So you might want to think through that strategy, right? Because you can't, there's no take backs, right? And I was just talking about this today with a colleague because sometimes we're both referred to do competency and insanity at the same time, which is interesting. I will say it varies across states and jurisdictions for how the law is applied. So that can get complex because I do work in different states and different jurisdictions, but it is rarely used. I have done insanity successfully on a homicide case, in fact. Um, and I think a misconception about insanity is that they are guilty, guilty but insane. The wording is confusing, and it doesn't help that the wording is different in different states, and there's different rules. Some states don't even have, in you know, not guilty by reason of insanity. So I've worked with CONRIP, a conditional release program where people who were found guilty by reason of insanity and had killed people, and they served their time at the state hospital. And a lot of times they'd serve about 10 years. And I think people don't always understand that they get out. And there's no murder registry. So one thing that people don't understand is that you could be committed to the state hospital indefinitely, and you could end up getting stuck there for decades and have a hard time finding your way out. So I would assess people at the state hospital to determine if they were ready for release. And those were some interesting conversations, like if they're still homicidal or still, right, still a danger to society. Um, so I think a lot of people forget about what happens to these individuals after the criminal case, right? And after they go and they're in the state hospital. Um, but many of them do get out, and you may not hear about that or know about that. And I think that what I see through the social media, when people hear about someone using insanity as defense, people get angry and think they're getting away with something. That's not quite right, because I've written an insanity report for someone who's completely psychotic and out of their mind and was having like a schizophrenic break. And they had an altered state of mind and they did kill multiple people and they were insane. And so some of the homicide cases I've done, the some of these people are just devastated and they're crying and they're horrified at what, once they become stable about what actions they did. And that is a tragedy, right? So that's so it's just kind of a disconnect, right? So media can portray this monster and maybe you just don't have all the information.
So let's say somebody's been like committed to a hospital, right, for like say like two, three, four murders. When they're convicted, they're like in prison, it can be like consecutive or concurrent, right? Like you're serving all four of those murders at the same time, correct? Like for instance, like if you're in a mental hospital, you don't serve say like 10 years for this, then you have the other three to serve, right? Like you're serving it all concurrently, and like if you are quote unquote deemed cured or whatever it is, then you just are released. There's no like stipulations of your release, right? Like for instance, in prisons, like parole, like you can't leave the state or the county or you're on house arrest or whatever. Like it's the complete opposite for somebody that gets released from a hospital, correct?
Now, clarify that last statement. Like,
Like so say like somebody like let's say Ed Gein, right? He was in a psychiatric hospital. Like let's say he was released if they deemed him to be better, would he be like um would he be like required to like be assessed by people like when he gets out, like like a parole officer, you have to check in, do drug tests, maybe counseling or anger management, stuff like that.
okay, I got you. So, yes, it depends, but so I worked for a program called CONREP, conditional release. So offenders that were released. So I also interviewed them at the state hospital to assess their readiness for release. Many were already released, and I supervised them in the community, and they had committed like at least one murder. And they were under my, well, I was a clinician at the time, and we could do drug tests. I wrote risk assessment reports to the court, quarterly reports to the judge, and I would meet with them one-on-one, and I taught groups, and I was with them 5 days a week. And I'll tell you a story. So sometimes these folks were a handful and they were breaking the law and getting into other trouble. And so if they did, um, I'll tell you that I had one client who I found out he had, in his previous crimes, had raped women. And I'm not sure why it was overlooked, but I was looking in his file and I went a little too deep and was like, this is very concerning. Um, and he was lying to me about events he was going to, like saying he had a doctor's appointment or some appointment, and I would call and they're like, never heard of him. He was lying. And part of the terms of his parole was he couldn't be in certain locations. And he was, in fact, going there, and that was a violation. And we called and reported him for being in violation, and they came and picked him up and returned him to the state hospital for being in violation. So if you fail a drug test or you're not compliant with the terms and conditions, you actually go straight to back to the state hospital. And the ambulance did pick him up and strap him down and like took him away. Um, so you're on a tight leash like parole, right? You have to follow these terms and conditions. And I would drug test them, and um, they had their own housing that they lived together that was paid for. So they were in the community, and they were trying to reintegrate them back into the community. Sometimes they would have violent ideations or like homicidal thoughts. And so we had a psychiatrist on site. So we were always, you know, we had the power to readmit them. But hopefully, so keeping track of them and their meds and keeping them stable every day, like I had eyes on them every day. Some of them were child molesters, and they would have thoughts about reoffending, and that was really interesting. But we would write reports to the court to let them know why they're still a risk and they need to be continue to be supervised. They could graduate from the program when they show that they're no longer a risk, right? They've been stable for a long time and they're not doing any of these things.
Hmm. On the topic of like child molesters and like sex offenders and stuff like that, what is your opinion on chemical castration? I know that there's at least one state in the US that offers that right now for early release for either like child rapist or just sex offenders in general, I believe.
Yeah, and when you say castration, tell me a little bit more about exactly what you're.
Well, I'm if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure that they snip the part where it allows you to have an erection, right? I'm pretty sure that's what chemical castration is, right?
So I'm not really involved, or haven't really looked at the research on that, but in my experience of interviewing sexually violent predators, so even when they can't perform that function any longer, they still will have thoughts and impulses and use other methods to offend, whether it's another object. So it's not the answer uh, when it comes to very violent sexual predators. I have interviewed some of them before, and even if they can't have an erection or don't have access to someone, they can still be violent and act out in other ways. So I'm not sure the literature on that. That's not my specialty, but um,
Right. Yeah, I've always been curious about that because I talked to quite a few pedophiles in prison that have either attempted to kill or have killed children, and a lot of them are like, if you could chemically castrate me, I would get out to this day if that was an option. Like, well, I don't know if they'd let you out, but maybe it would minimize some of your thoughts or whatever. I don't know. I'm not really sure how that works in their mind. Not many of them are really too open to discussing their fantasies and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, I was just curious if you had any like research or if you looked into that or anything like that. Um, so have you worked with any prisoners who've made you uncomfortable in any way, shape, or form? I know you work with a lot of violent people, so I can imagine there's been like one or two, if not more.
yeah, I've definitely encountered some very ominous individuals who have been threatening or made statements to harm me. And yeah, I've had some interesting situations. Um, I'll tell you, yeah, I've definitely, um, I think it's important to protect yourself and have good boundaries and keep a healthy distance away so that you are safe during interviews. And I, my recommendation is to always stay an arm lengths away so that if anyone tries to strike or swing at you, they will not make contact with you. So if a lot of the interviews I do now are behind glass or there's a table between us. But when I've worked in a lot of different settings where there was no barriers between us and with some very dangerous people who want to hurt you. So I always keep a safe distance away.
Yeah, that makes sense. Whenever I visited death row, I've sat right next to them, which probably wasn't a good idea looking back now. But especially in a cage where it takes them like 2 to 5 minutes to get in there if they were to hurt you. So yeah.
Yeah, I've had people take swings and many times, but not make contact. And I'm always just can react fast enough, or I'm already moving back, right? So in the psych hospital, a lot of people are psychotic and, you know, they require um, a physical intervention. So that was a daily event, people that needing physically restrained. And we could put them in 4-point restraints, sometimes having to wear a spit mask and strap them down. So that was part of our training. I um, physically restraining people and strapping them down. And a lot of times I would talk to them or talk them through it or negotiate with them to see when they're ready to get out of restraints. I did a lot of behavioral contracts, like negotiating for safe behavior. Um, yeah, I would say it's a dangerous position if I would just be well prepared for anything to happen. These people can be very impulsive and unpredictable. So you always want to be cognizant of that. And don't let your guard down. I could tell you about the 2 times I let my guard down and I was physically assaulted. And um, yeah, and they were both by females.
Hmm.
Yeah, and maybe that's why I let my guard down a little bit, right? There was a very psychotic individual, and she was having, command, auditory hallucinations from God, think thoughts about killing someone. Those are all red flags. But I was wanting to talk her into, psychiatric medication and get a little background information as she just came into the hospital, and I thought I would meet with her one-on-one and had her in my office, like in a chair. I was in my office, and she said something to me like that she wanted to kill me. And I leaned in just a little bit when I shouldn't have. This was a long time ago. And I said, why would you say that? I was, and she ended up striking me across the face. And she went to grab the scissors behind me to stab me and grab the phone at the same time to try to call 911. I ended up disarming her and putting her arms behind her back and like was moving her out of the office. And I caught the attention of staff and we put her in isolation. So I was able to defend myself. Um, but later she was pressed up against the glass in the safety room and she was saying that she was trying to call 911 to tell them that I was dead because she was going to kill me. And she was very psychotic. But luckily, I wasn't injured or hurt. I acted very quickly, but uh, that was um, after that, we put security cameras in my office. That was just, um, I would never put myself in that situation again.
Right. Yeah.
But
Better safe than sorry for sure.
you learn real quick. But so you always have to be thinking about your safety, and that was, um, yeah. Um, Luckily, I've never been injured or uh, had anything traumatic happen over the last decade, right? But actually, lots of my coworkers have been hospitalized, right? And had serious injuries. So I think so you really have to be thinking about your safety all the time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I can only imagine, especially with people that are 5150 or like severely mentally ill. I'd be terrified, to be honest.
Yeah. So yeah, during my time working in the psych hospital, I testified in about 850 hearings and with the patient present. And I was, yeah, sometimes they could start yelling or screaming, or there's a physical intervention and they're carried off. Um, so those could be some intense hearings. So I would be testifying that they are still either a harm to themselves or to others, or they are gravely disabled, which means they are not able to care for themselves and they need to continue to stay here. So I would present it very calmly with the patient present, but sometimes the patient was homicidal and they wanted to kill me or kill multiple people or had. And so usually there was like one or two guards next to them, and I would talk to the patient before the hearing and let them know exactly what was going to happen and how it was going to happen and calmly talk them through it. But obviously they could disagree with my opinion. Um, but those could be some intense moments, like, or after the hearing, I would not return to the unit until it was safe to do so, right? Till that person was calmed down. And so a lot
So,
of violent encounters.
yeah, I can only imagine. Um, so if you can sit down with any prisoner and or patient, dead or alive, for a forensic interview, who would you choose?
Oh, I don't have anyone on my bucket list. Um, Someone called me recently and wanted to interview Ed Kemper, and I was like, okay, that sounds interesting because he is still alive. Um, I guess there's nobody that I'm just dying to talk to because I feel like I do already get that every day, like I feel like I have enough interesting interviews. Um, yeah, who should I talk to?
Um, well, Ed Kemper would be amazing, but his
Okay.
I don't know how easy it would be to get to him, but somebody that's more realistic, I think Gary Ridgway would be a fun one to do. I mean, he's reclusive, and I hear that he's dying from cancer too, but he would be super interesting to talk to. I've tried him ever since he was arrested because I live in Washington State. You know, I remember when that was going on, and I would do almost anything to do an interview with him.
Anything, huh?
Almost anything.
Oh, Andrew, I didn't know you were that kind of guy. What are you willing to do? So, well, I would, I'll interview him with you.
That would be awesome. Yeah, I I've always been fascinated with Ridgeway. I mean, he's besides Bundy, he's our state's most notorious serial killer like that's ever existed. But
Yeah, I would find it interesting. I would be curious if he's willing to do interviews or how he feels about that. Um, Sometimes these individuals have their own reason why they want to be interviewed. They want to have their own narrative or their own attention or reframe things or try to invoke empathy or whatever. But in any event, it still tells us a lot about them, right?
right, you know, it's funny that you say that with some. It's mostly serial killers. They'll be like, "Well, what am I going to get out of this?" I'm like, "Well, you'll be able to tell your story. You'll be able to be, people will be able to finally hear from your mouth your point of view." And then like 9 times out of 10, after I usually do an interview with a serial killer, they'll be like, "How's it going? What's the comments like? Like how many, like what's the reception like? Can we do another one?" Because they just, I guess they enjoy the attention. And sometimes after I release interviews with them, they'll get new pen pals and they'll tell me all about it. Like, oh, I'm in a relationship now, or I have new people writing me, sending me money, this and that. And, I'm just like, that's awesome.
Wait a second. You're like the love connection. You're like getting serial killers pen pals.
Well, some of the high profile ones, yeah, have had a lot of people write. Um, it's pretty interesting. Like, yeah, there's one guy in particular in California, that gets a lot of love interests. Chester Turner is his name, the Southside Slayer. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he goes
I
through a
haven't.
lot of women. He killed, well, technically it's 14 death sentences now, but he did have 15 death sentences at one point. But the 8-month fetus was overturned for some strange reason, and now he's doing 14 death sentences in California. But um, yeah, Hibistophilia is really interesting to me, and I'll never understand it. But I think it's just so. I think it's more fascinating than serial killing itself. Like how somebody can fall in love with somebody who's raped and mutilated woman or children or whatever. Like how can you look past that or be attracted to that in the same breath? Like I don't get it, but to each their own. I'm the last person that's gonna judge somebody, but I might think it's a little weird, but I guess I'm a little weird myself.
Yeah, it is true. There is this populace of women that are fascinated with these violent men and are attracted to them. And there is some personality pathology there. And I've interfaced with some of these women, and even in criminal trials for rape, um, they start pairing up with these men. And then I've even had them call me and being like, can you help them? And there's there's sort of a theme on what type of individuals these are, these women. They can be very codependent. And it is really interesting to hear how they try to rationalize like their role in this relationship or how they're going to change this person.
hmm
And um, there's definitely some personality disorder going on there. And it's hard to watch sometimes. Say
Yeah.
that. Like to watch the destruction, because at first it's not ominous, it's love bombing, and this person's getting a lot of attention. And for the female, or the relationship, they're they're getting one-on-one attention, right? Right? And sometimes these women just feel like they they hold this power, like to be the woman that can bring in the conjugal visits or bring them things or um yeah. It's it's an epidemic. I have worked with a lot of men who are incarcerated or who are repeat offenders, and there is these females that are behind helping support them, and I've had lots of conversations with them, and it's difficult because they're always bailing them out of jail, picking them up from the psych hospital, or rationalizing their behavior. So it's hard. Um, from my perspective, when I'm working in this situation, there's just a high level of denial about like the seriousness of what is happening. Um, I always recommend they get some treatment and to see a psychologist or someone to kind of figure out why they are have to remain in these relationships.
Right. And it's pretty interesting because not always it's not always like weird, sheltered women or men. Sometimes it's like doctors or lawyers or prison guards. Like for instance, Oscar Ray Bolin, he's an executed serial killer in Florida. His like I don't know if she's a public defender or paid lawyer at the time, but she left her boyfriend or husband and kids or something like that to be with this serial killer who was later executed. And I'm thinking to myself, like, why in your right mind would you do that? Like leaving your husband or boyfriend and kids for a guy that's gonna die in prison sooner than later. It's just, and she had like a great career, a great life, and she went from that overnight to being with a serial killer that's gonna die on death row. I don't know. I don't really understand it.
Well, you won't find me doing that in my lifetime.
Well, that's good. That's good. I always
I have
find,
no, I'm not attracted to killers.
right, right. Yeah.
No.
The manipulation with a lot of them is pretty fascinating. Like a lot of them will even try to manipulate me and to doing things. Like one guy told me one time that he would pay me $10,000 if I smuggled in some drugs and some cell phones into San Quentin. And I'm like, you could offer me $1 million and I still wouldn't do it. Like I'm not one of these people that are gonna bow down to you just because, you did what you did. Like you can try to get one of your pen pals to do that.
My sister is a nurse. She worked in a prison, and a fellow nurse was sneaking in things and doing that. And um, that unfolded, right? Um, and these inmates are so manipulative and they'll stroke your ego. I mean, this you've got to recognize the signs like of manipulation, but for someone that's vulnerable or wants that attention or needs that, they will give it to you. Trust me. But I don't want it. I don't need any compliments or attention from anyone anytime. It doesn't mean what you think it means. It's just manipulation. So know you're being played. And when you know the anatomy of a setup, like it's subtle over time, but they form a connection and a relationship to you, and you're getting played. And in the end, um, the nurse was giving hand jobs to the inmates while they're waiting to see the psychiatrist behind the desk, like she moved things around. I don't ask me why they're, how this was out of view of the cameras or whatever, but um or giving some of these nurses will give massages or hugs, or it starts out, or it's just like a little bit of extra pain pills or aspirin or Tylenol or cop. Like it's like over time they work on this relationship, and then it's like there's this rationalization, and in the end, the nurse denied that there was never any problem and went to get engaged with him and was fired, but like the relationship continued. So just the level of denial that it's wrong, it's criminal also. And it's in the end, like follow the story, these stories that healthcare workers, nurses, or people that have direct contact with these inmates, like follow the story out. It ends up not in a good, like these people lose everything in the end. Like, you mean besides your license, right? And
Right.
I mean, there's plenty. I have heard the stories of psychologists doing the same thing. And so just know the anatomy of a setup. Like, no one can play me. Like, I know the game, they're playing it. Uh, just um, like some people are just easy to manipulate, or just gullible, or just need attention. You never want to be in a position in this role where I just need attention or need
Mhm.
affirmation. I don't need that. Um, that's that would mean I'm in a deficit. Like I don't want to come into a place and be in some emotional deficit. Like I don't know how to carry myself or interact. Like, no, I'm the boss. Like I set the rules, not you.
Right, right. Yeah, and what comes to mind is I forget the inmate's name, Sweat and somebody else. Remember that New York prison break where I think it was New York, or maybe it was a different state, where the prison guard broke the guy out. They were in love, and he ended up killing her. And then I think he's in prison for life now, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, what's that called?
There was a documentary not that long ago made about it. I think it was on Netflix, I want to say. I totally forget the case, but I remember the story. It was like less than 5 or 6 years ago, I want to say.
Oh, I want to think of it.
I forget her name, but it was all over the news for the longest time, and they weren't sure if she had killed herself or if he had killed her. Um, I'm totally blanking on the case though, but that's a prime example of why you don't fall in love with the person in prison and try to break them out of prison or break them out of prison for that matter.
Yeah, and I always caution people like why do you want to be in this profession? And so how they answer that question is important. Like, it tells about who they are. And so you just got to remember what your role is, and having boundaries. And I think many people really aren't fit to be working with this population, and they shouldn't. And that's why there should be, screening measures where people pass a psychological background. So, as a psychologist, we can do background psychological evaluations for police officers. I do them for other psychologists or other mental health professions, but so we can be appointed to do that. I'm actually appointed when someone's in trouble with the licensing board. So I'll evaluate them. And yeah, so people get in trouble, and it usually has to do with inappropriate boundaries. Like, you know, they're in an emotional deficit. You could be depressed or not feel good about yourself, low self-esteem, or needing attention. Like, there's always someone will come along to right.
Right, right.
It's yeah. I mean, so I just think it's so important if you're going to work in the mental health field or in this population, you need to take care of your mental health, be emotionally fit, and no one can violate my boundaries. I'm not, I'm pretty strict and uh people don't fuck with me. That's what I'm saying. Like, I may just make it really clear who I am, what I stand for, my boundaries. I mean, nobody touches me, no one hugs me. We're not, um, I just make it clear and I don't have any problems typically. There's just no nonsense. And I'm just a straight shooter. And that works out well for me. So,
Yeah, that's good. That's good. That's good that you can have boundaries and stick to them. And because there's a lot of manipulative people in prisons and in hospitals, for that matter, I've come to find out.
yeah, I've had some tough conversations with uh, a lot of just across settings, but yeah, you just get better over time, like about um, setting your boundaries and yeah. So I've had some just crazy situations, right? So dangerous, violent people that like want to harm you or like are threatening to you, and then to be in a conversation with them and to figure out how to best proceed, like without violence, to negotiate, right? So they're not going to be violent to me or anyone. And I would put them on a safety plan or like set specific rules for them. Um, and yeah, so that's what a forensic psychologist does. Uh, I find it, um, I find it like a good challenge. Like I find it, um, I've enjoyed my work.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm sure it's rewarding too because I mean, you are working with really dangerous individuals, and I mean, there's a possibility you could maybe somehow get them to not, take another life or be violent or even just for one day, like get those thoughts out of their mind. I mean, I'm sure they appreciate it in a weird roundabout way too.
Yeah, yeah, and I use a sense of humor too a lot, even when it might be kind of inappropriate, but like, you know, right, I'm still trying to negotiate and like appeal, like how are we going to agree to safety, right? So a lot of times I'd have homicidal people, it's like they want to kill their mom. So that's like a common, I don't know why that's that is something that is on replay all the time in cases I've intervened with. But it's like you're talking to them like, well, I can't release you from this hold because you still meet criteria. You still want to kill your mom, and you're saying you're going to go home and you're going to kill her and you have to. And I go, like, have you ever thought about doing anything different? Like, is there like anything else you can think of? Like, and then you get them to really think. And this is someone who's maybe they're psychotic also. They have different delusional belief. And it's like, well, you could not return home, right? You don't have
Right.
to live with your mom. And he's like, well, I have to. I'm like, you actually don't. And he's like, well, she has to die because the government replaced her with a bot. And so I have to kill them. And I'm like,
Mm.
even if the government did, like it's still a crime to kill them, like, and you'd go to jail. So like, how about not? And then like just all kinds of ways to be like, it's gonna be like, this is ridiculous. Like you still can't do this. Like you're going, and so um, a lot of people that want to burn their family's house down, like, or they're always rationalizing how they're gonna leave and do that. And you're like, but still, you're gonna, if you know, you're gonna go to prison. Even if you believe you should do this and you want to do this, like eventually, like the consequences, right? So um most of those folks are usually like have some psychosis and substance use and are just impulsive. A lot of people who are bipolar or unmedicated, right? and they're not in their right mind, um, getting involved in those crimes.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I would say for anyone that's interested in going into this field, I'd say get experience working in an inpatient psychiatric facility, and you will get to see a lot.
Yeah. Definitely a great career if you can handle it. I always wanted to be a forensic psychologist, and then I looked at the math classes and everything, and then I looked at what all you had to do educationally, and then I was like, I think I'm going to take a different path, which I did. But
Yeah, I think that's one of the main reasons why people are like, oh, wait, never mind. I'll just watch true crime shows or like, save money on the degree. Like, forensic psychology, like the process is just, it's expensive to
yeah,
get a
yeah, I can only
doctorate.
imagine. Yeah, because you
But
actually have to become a doctor. So yeah. Uh,
yeah, so that's another misconception because people are like, how do you become a forensic psychologist? Well, you actually have to go follow the guidelines outlined by the Board of Psychology in your state, right? And that typically requires a doctorate degree in psychology, and you have to take two tests, a law and ethics test. And so you have to know the laws, and then you have to take the EPPP exam for professional practice in psychology. So you have to pass both those and a criminal background check. And then you got to be mentally fit. And then there's just lots of requirements. So to get a doctorate, that can take 10 years total with education. So, and then to specialize in forensics. And so it is a lot of schooling. But the good news is forensic psychology is growing and I'm there's just a lot more interest in it now and a lot more people going to school for it. And so that's exciting. And notably, there is a lot of females interested in forensic psychology, a lot more than the guys.
yeah, I've noticed as of late, I have quite a few people on my Facebook actually that are going to school that want to become forensic psychologists, and I think it's really cool. But I feel like a lot of them have misconceptions like, oh, I'm gonna work with serial killers or mass murderers or spree killers all day long, and
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly work in prison and work with
Mhm.
those populace, but I think if people are thinking that way, I think take a look at the actual job of a psychologist in prison. And it might not be what you think it is. Like, you might want to interview people that actually work there and see what it's like the day in the life of, right? Because working in the prison is different than what I do, right? I'm working in my office here, interviewing
Right.
people remotely. I go to the jail, I do, um, but I'm not actually really interested in working in prison. Like,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, working in an office would be much more appealing to me than working in a prison because you always got to watch your back. You always got to be on your toes as we're in your office. You can just relax, keep your guard down, and just talk to people.
well, and then psychologically, the toll it takes being in these institutions for an extended period of time, uh, that does have an effect on you. And it can be intense. And I know because I've worked in intense settings, and I think it's good to have a change.
Right.
And it's just healthy for me to do a variety of things. So I'm not just stuck going to jail or being in the psych hospital. I think I'm in a much healthier place now, having all that experience, but now I'm free. I don't work a 9 to 5. I take clients or cases I want. I have freedom to go to hot yoga and do my self-care. My self-care is most important every day. And then I work around that. And I think that you can create your own life. It doesn't have to be, being a slave to some system, right? And for the government, or being overworked or underpaid. Like you can be your own boss. So I started my own company and get my own contracts and choose what I want to do. And that's like working out for me, I think. So compared to when I worked in the psych hospital and it was just traumatic all the time, you're on high alert all the time. Uh, it will affect you physiologically and mentally to be on high alert all the time, ready for someone to attack you. Like um, that's, I'm glad I'm no longer in that environment. I'll say that.
Yeah, yeah, I can only imagine. So to round us out, can you talk about your podcast, Killer Psychologist, what it's all about, and some of the guests that you've had on there and some of the topics that you cover?
Yeah, so Killer Psychologist is for people that want to learn about the role of a forensic psychologist in legal cases. And so while we can't talk about the cases we actually do, it's great that we can highlight cases in the media and I can interview other experts and highlight their skill sets. So I love talking to experts across the world, private investigators, attorneys, crime scene investigators, coroners, forensic nurses, forensic psychologists. So across the world that have worked in different settings, from a prison in India to, investigations in South Africa. And then recently, interviewed someone from Canada and crimes there and serial killers there. So it's like, it just helps me like understand crime like across the world and the different roles. And it's so interesting. So I feel like I'm excited because I get to learn new things. And then I love meeting new people, and it's a great social outlet for me. That's how I met you. And so you can always connect with me on social media and let me know who you would like me to interview or what cases you would like me to cover. Sometimes I get cases that are cold cases that family wants me to help work on, and we'll look at them and we'll discuss them on the air. We'll look at the whole file and talk about why it's wrongful death, the laws, how to repeal it, how do we go through this. So real experts going through it in real time, and you can tune in and like, I just want to, yeah, kind of provide the education for what a forensic psychologist is, because there is a lot of students actually interested in this and are like getting wrong information. So I kind of just share what I do and have some killer guests. And so I've had a wonderful experience just meeting people, and just it's a lot of respect for the other roles that people do, that we all help solve crimes, we all work together, and we've it's been really meaningful, some of the things that we've been able to do, and just highlight people's stories, people that have been victims, right? Or I just interviewed a friend of mine I went to school with for 12 years. She was being sexually abused as a 12-year-old at my school by a 42-year-old teacher, and I didn't know. I and I interviewed her on the podcast she sued the school successfully. It was a civil lawsuit. So that was just a story. So I'm really open to share anyone's story. And yeah, that's a little bit about my my podcast.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on today. I know we've had a few scheduling conflicts, but I'm glad we were able to do this and get stuff done. And in the future, I have a few offenders that I'd like to do like a joint interview with you with if you're interested. One's a spree killer, one's a serial killer, and the spree killer wants to argue with an expert as to why he's a serial killer and not a spree killer, which I don't think he'll win that argument, but I think it would be interesting nonetheless.
Okay. Well, yeah, you can't argue with a narcissist, but they'll have their own narrative and they want their own credit or attention. But it will be interesting to listen.
Right,
And
right.
then
Yeah.
yeah, I'm down for that. Thanks for having me, Andrew.
All right, thank you so much. That was my interview with the killer psychologist, Dr. Dana Anderson. Thank you for listening.